Hello, everyone. Good day or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to this session to discuss the newly launched report by Maria Snegovaya and my old friend and colleague, Dr. Anders Åslund, The Impact of Western Sanctions on Russia. This is a topic dear to my heart, and full disclosure, I was deeply involved in the Obama administration's policy toward Russia, particularly the imposition of sanctions after the Kremlin invasion of Ukraine in 2014. This paper is a major piece of work. It covers the impact of sanctions both on Kremlin behavior and on the Russian economy, discusses the challenges of their implementation, including the mistakes that the US government has made, and looks at the future, ways to make sanctions work. It includes economic analysis, it includes a political assessment of the nature of Putin's regime, and the two authors are exceptionally well qualified to do this work. Dr. Maria Snegovaya is a rising generation all-star in the field. She went to Columbia's Harriman Institute, political science faculty, decades after I did, but it was and remains an excellent place, and she brings the perspective of both countries, shall I say, a powerful, powerful approach. Anders Åslund and I were young diplomats in the Soviet Union, and I was almost a young diplomat in Poland. We spent many years in both countries. Dr. Anders Åslund is one of the world's experts on the political economy of post-communist transformation. When it works, which is Poland, and when it doesn't work, which is Russia, and the results are both impressive and tragic, respectively. He is both an economist, but also someone who knows the dynamics of Russia. We have on as discussants, Dr. Sergey Aleksashenko, who is, his credentials are so great I am embarrassed to cite them. A former deputy chairman of the Russian Central Bank. In the 1990s, he was on the board of Sberbank, of VTB, a deputy minister of finance. In the early 2000s, he was the CEO of Merrill Lynch, Russia. In 2014, not a bad year to do it, he relocated to the United States. He's on the board of the Free Russia Foundation. Again, his perspective gives him an inside view as well as an outsider's perspective, an inside view of Russia, an outsider's view of the United States. And these are valuable perspectives. So it is a great discussion. I will start off, well, I'm going to hand the floor to Maria Snegovaya, but I will start off with a personal note. That is, I read the report's analysis of the impact of sanctions on the Russian economy with extreme interest because, and here's a secret, in the world of policymaking, we like to pretend that we analyze the impact of our actions thoroughly before we take steps. That is almost never the case because the most important decisions you often have to make on the fly when you don't have months for a detailed analysis. You do the best you can based on the intellectual capital you've got. Now, Elina, oh my goodness, I also forgot, my God, Elina Ribakova, our second discussant, a deputy chief economist of the Institute of International Finance, and who started her career as an economist for the IMF. She is taught at the London School of Economics and the Stockholm School of Economics. And my apologies, Elina, my apologies. I'm so taken away by this substance that I'm not doing my job properly, and my apologies to you. Our two discussants will go through the paper, but I wanted to say that the economic analysis is fascinating to me because we thought there would be an impact in 2014 and 15, but We did not have time to run the numbers thoroughly. We did the best we could. So with that, and again, Dr. Ribakova, my apologies. Let me turn the floor over. I believe it is Dr. Snegovaya first to discuss the paper, and then Anders Åslund.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Fried. It's a big honor for us to have you here today, and thank you very much for excellent introduction of our report. Many of the analysis of Russia sanctions or the sanctions that were imposed on the Kremlin behavior in the past ignore or do not focus in detail on the nature of the system that Putin regime has built in Russia. In this report, we argue that actually to be able to estimate the impact of sanctions, it's very important to keep in mind what sort of political system, political regime we are dealing with. And here, of course, I bring up the political science dimension of based on my background. So we argue in this report that the best way to describe the regime that emerged in Russia by now is kleptocratic or neo-patrimonial autocracy. And what does it mean? The essence of such regimes has to do with the fact that the regimes rely in purchase of support of the population and elite by consistent redistribution of the rent. This constant flow of rents to the regime's coffers is absolutely crucial for sustainability of the regime's support. This flow of rents may be achieved through, maybe received from say oil or resource rent, but can also be sustained by rents coming from taxes, natural resources, state-owned companies' revenues, asset stripping, and public procurement. Precisely because of that, there's little distinction. These rulers, these regimes, they make little distinction between the public and private coffers, routinely dipping into the state treasury for their own political need. Very important that the regimes of such types are not ideological. And the key goal of Putin regime and the cronies surrounding Putin is really to sustain the hold on power. We argue in our report that it's primarily for these lenses that the Kremlin's foreign policy should be seen. It's designed to promote the interests of current Kremlin elite rather than Russian population more broadly. And anyone of long-term watchers of Russia definitely would probably agree with us on this. Now, with that in mind, what sort of sanctions has the West imposed on the Kremlin or Russia in the recent years, and to what extent are they effective? We distinguish, which is a very classic approach, between three major types of sanctions. Personal sanctions on human rights violations and corrupt businessmen working for the Kremlin, financial sanctions, and technological sanctions. The first type, the personal sanctions, they were introduced first as part of the so-called Sergey Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act, based in 2012, subsequently expanded into Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, and reinforced through the American Adversaries for Sanctions Act, CAATS, which famously, among other things, sanctions Oleg Deripaska, the owner of the second largest aluminium producing company, Rusal. The second, I'm not going to be focusing much on the effectiveness of the sanctions, and Anders will be talking in more detail about the economic impact. The second type, technological sanctions, introduced on three types of oil technology in Russia, projects in the Arctic, deep water, and shale fields. And overall, over the long term, they contribute to Russia's accumulating economic slowdown and essentially technological backwardness. Ultimately, the last type of sanctions, the key focus of our today's report, are financial sanctions, which were introduced primarily as a result of Russia's occupation of Crimea and subsequent occupation of incursion into eastern Ukraine, so to speak. We argue that actually the cumulative impact of the sanctions is more effective is stronger than was believed before. While it's definitely fair to say that the Western sanctions have not succeeded in forcing the Kremlin to fully reverse its action, on the international stage, be it Ukraine or say, I don't know, interference in the US domestic process, the economic impact of financial sanctions on Russia has been much greater than previously understood. And having said that, I will provide the floor to my co-author, Dr. Anders Åslund.
Thank you very much, Maria. And the starting point here is the old impression from the Soviet Union. When Ambassador Fried and I served as young diplomats in Moscow in the 1980s, Soviet agriculture was said to suffer from 4 problems: spring, summer, fall, and winter, also known as the weather. Vladimir Putin is slightly more sophisticated. He blames external factors, also known as the oil price. Our argument is that, as Maria just said, is that financial sanctions that were imposed in July 2014 have been much more effective in reducing Russia's economic growth than has been understood. When Vladimir Putin talks about the Russian economy, he emphasizes various measures of macroeconomic stability: the low inflation, minimal budget deficit, low public debt, and steady current account surpluses and international currency reserves. But he says very little or nothing about economic growth, and he avoids the standard of living as he can. And this is the issue. So one can distinguish 4 direct effects from Western financial sanctions: declining foreign debt, that is forced deleveraging, reduced foreign direct investment, strong capital outflows, and extremely cautious government macroeconomic policy. So what we call this extreme austerity policy is not an advantage, but a disadvantage. And the Institute of International Finance in its report has pointed to 3 possible channels of macroeconomic effects caused by sanctions. And the first channel is the fiscal channel, that is, the government is forced to raise taxes or cut spending, normally to cut spending. Second, the balance of payments channel that forces Russia to cut back on imports and to increase its exports in face of lower capital inflows and larger capital outflows. And the third is the balance sheet channel, forcing the government or state banks and state-owned enterprises to deleverage. So the fundamental point we make is that this is not disadvantageous, but is advantageous to pursue this extreme austerity policy. And what we have calculated is how much capital has Russia foregone. And our assessment is a total of almost $1 trillion. I could mention that Russia has lost about as much on a lower oil and gas price and other lower commodity prices since 2014. So the natural thing is to see that the oil price and the financial sanctions have had a similar size. And then we look more carefully at it, considering all the costs of additional capital and presumed additional imports. And we arrive at a possible additional growth of 2.5% to 3% a year during the 7 years of sanction, 2014 to 2020. That is a total of $350 billion in the course of these 7 years, or an average of $50 billion a year. So then you wonder, how does it compare with other assessments? The 2 most common assessments that are being used are both from the IMF. The first was an IMF study early on from 2015 that concluded, I quote, that sanctions and counter-sanctions could initially reduce real GDP by 1 to 1.5% a year. That is what I have used so far, but now I would prefer to double the number, as I've just said. And then you have another number which I think has rather muddled the water. It's in 2019, the IMF noticed, I quote, output growth averaged 0.5% in 2014 to 18, over 2 percentage points a year slower than originally projected. Of this, the IMF concluded that only 0.2 percentage points were caused by sanctions, but attributed 1 percentage points to fiscal factors and 1.2 percentage points to monetary and financial factors. All this depends really on assumptions and definitions. First, the IMF starts with below originally projected growth, which was barely 3% a year. 5% would have more sense. The Central European countries have had a growth of 4 to 5% a year during this period. That's Hungary, Romania, Poland, and for that matter also Turkey. And note that all these four countries are actually today richer than Russia in GDP per capita, whether you count it in the current US dollars or in purchasing power parities. And so Russia should have a growth rate not of 3%, but of 5% if there hadn't been Western sanctions and bad economic policy. The second is that the fiscal effects, as well as the monetary and financial factors, are really effects of belt tightening that Russia was compelled to endure because of the financial sanctions. So here we come to a question of definition. And this would mean that this IMF number is really financial sanction effects of a total of 2.4% a year during the years 2014 to 2018. And that would mean that our assessment is actually in the same ballpark as the IMF numbers. And Maria already touched upon is that the effectiveness of the Western sanctions on Russia is often a question. And it's true that they have not persuaded the Kremlin to withdraw from Ukraine, but they did stop Vladimir Putin's pre-announced military offensive into Ukraine in the summer of 2014. That's an obvious achievement. And the second is that the sanctions have hit the Russian economy so badly. And this means that the standard of living has fallen by 11% during this period, giving the Kremlin much less resources. So how should the sanctions be pursued further? First of all, the sanctions should be made more effective through a greater transparency of the sanction funds in the West. The most important thing here is transparency. And thanks to the new US Corporate Transparency Act, this should come about, and the European Union has adopted similar legislation. Second, the weakest link is the actual enforcement. And the US compliance agency, FinCEN, at the US Treasury needs to be reinforced and greatly expanded. This is should be the main point. And then thirdly, the US needs to take a perspective on how to accomplish more. Our colleagues, Michael Carpenter and Ambassador Alexander Verschbaum, have suggested that the US should gradually ratchet up sanctions if Russia does not withdraw from Donbass and pre-announce these aggravations on sanctions. And then, of course, it's often said that the resources of sanctions are exhausted. We don't think so. Much more can be done. And the big eventual targets are to take Russia out of SWIFT and to sanction Russia's central bank reserves of $570 billion. We do not advocate it, but it's just to point out that there are much more resources. What should be done first is to gradually tighten the financial sanctions so that the Russian public sector gets even less resources. Thank you.
Thank you both for this summary of a paper which is rich in material and deep in analysis. But let's turn to our discussants. First of all, Dr. Elina Ribakova, to give her reaction to the paper, and then, of course, we'll turn to Dr. Aleksashenko. But first, Dr. Ribakova.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Anders and Maria, for this fantastic paper. And I think the paper is extremely important contribution for two reasons. There are many reasons, but I want to emphasize two reasons. One is that we're using now economic sanctions as a full integral part of the foreign policy toolbox. It has been used in the past, the national economic security or national economic sovereignty. I think those discussions were very common maybe 50 or more years ago, but until recently, we used to thinking about economic policy separately, foreign policy separately, national economic security separately. Everything used to be very separate. Over the last 5 years, or maybe a little bit more, that has started changing. And I think for the US, that's been very important, the change towards Russia and use of this economic sanctions towards Russia, which is still a very highly integrated global financial commodity markets economy. It's not exactly the same as using sanctions towards either Iran, North Korea, or even Venezuela. So therefore, using sanctions as a part of the national economic security or foreign policy objectives on a highly integrated global into global economy, global markets country, I think that's something that is is coming back. And also we see the discussions even about China, right? So I think therefore a contribution of somebody who looks at economics as well as the structure of the Russian policy, economic and political regime, and trying to see how we can be most effective by taking the holistic view. I think to me that's one of the first very important contributions of this paper. The second important contribution is trying to dig through the details and look at the nuance, right? In some ways, Russia, one would say, benefited and went for much more conservative macroeconomic policies that anybody would have expected before 2014. Remember, we used to talk about growing foreign debt, irresponsibility, potentially strong ruble strengthening, and now it's in a way, even despite sanctions, risk has been a darling of the fixed income short-term portfolio investor, right? So one could say, well, look, the sanctions haven't really worked exactly as intended. On the other hand, a lot of this macroeconomic adjustment came at the cost of a common person in Russia, right? And as the paper clearly spells it out, and I think in the context of some of the recent demonstrations and the worries of the United Party Russia, the regional elections, and also the national election. I think that's partially reflective of that, that the health expenditure has been cut, and especially with the COVID hit, we paid with that money for sanctions. So I think that's another very important nuance. Then I can talk much more, and we want to leave room for questions and also Professor Aleksashenko's comments. But I want to say that I've really enjoyed also the conclusions where the focus is on making sure sanctions are multilateral, that there is a way of scaling up and also scaling down sanctions. Because right now we're in this weird equilibrium where we're increasingly using up the sticks. Of course, there are some left, but we're using them up. But there are almost no carrots we can offer. And I think that's something that is needs to be studied, and I think the paper flags it out. And then also looking at transparent and focused sanctions. Why are we going after certain individuals? Why are we not targeting some of the sanctions more specifically after specific people? And I think that's also a very important contribution, because we all are discussing indeed, could it be SWIFT? Could it be debt? But we are forgetting that within this range of available options, the big picture macroeconomic options are not the only ones. There are also, the visa regimes that you point out. There's also the ease of access to financial markets globally. These are all extremely important measures that we, at least on the macroeconomic side, of course, don't look at closely. And therefore, it's particularly helpful that Anders's and Maria's paper does and provides suggestions. So with that, I will conclude and pass on the word to Sergey Aleksashenko. Thank you so much.
Dr. Aleksashenko, the floor is yours.
Comment to everybody, and that's why I really appreciate the new report, and I fully support view of Dr. Ribakova that it is very temporary and very comprehensive report that everybody should read. Nevertheless, I am a little bit more skeptical about the report, about the conclusions, because I do not believe that sanctions were very effective. Let's make a look. What were the goals? What have been reached? And what are the effects that is measured by the authors? What were the goals in the sanctions? First of all, Russian leadership must stop its support for separatists. We want political solution in respect of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Send a strong message to Russian government that there are consequences, and the United States is prepared to take additional steps to impose further political and economic costs. Let us remember that the most serious and the last economic sanctions that we discuss all the way along and in this report were imposed in September 2014, and nothing after that. What have been reached? Putin's expansionist dreams were not fulfilled, and the likely reason was after Russian military offense started in July. Let me remind you that Russian military offense in the summer of 2014 ended in September after Ilovaisk, and the Minsk agreement was signed on September 5, while sanctions that touched financial sector, defense, and oil were imposed 1 week later. Moreover, those sanctions were imposed 8 weeks after the Malaysian MH17 was shut down. In January-February 2015, Russia implemented a new offense occupying the Baltsevo area, and there was no reaction from the West. So I do not believe that those sanctions stopped Putin's aggressive policy. Even if it is not military offense, but we may say that Russia has destroyed Ukrainian foreign trade with Central Asian countries and permanently cyber attacks Ukraine and other neighboring countries. Territorial integrity is not reestablished. There is no any negotiations looking for peaceful political solutions. Russian leadership has not stopped its support for separatists, and definitely Russia is not isolated on the international arena. Nevertheless, for me, as an economist, maybe the most interesting part was the focus on the effect of financial sanctions, where authors conclude that the possible additional an annual growth of 2.5% to 3% a year during 7 years, that is the impact of Western financial sanctions. That is really a major statement because it's not in line with other statements by different people. And authors say that we can deduct those, we can decompose those effects in net flows of foreign direct investment. They have declined, and the decline in foreign debt. Let's make a look. There are 3 views quoted in the paper. It's IMF, it's Gurevich and Prelevsky and Korkhanen, and everybody agrees that the impact of Western sanctions is much lower. It was IMF estimated it's 1 to 1.5% in 2014-15, and those who knew how Russian economy reacted to that, what happened in Russia in December 2014, and later on in the first half of 2015, they do remember what is serious impact of Western sanctions. Since then, I do not see any disturbances in the Russian financial market, and nevertheless, it may happen. It may happen that all of us, of economists, we do not pay serious attention, and maybe authors have disclosed some interesting facts. But maybe the effect of Western sanctions is much stronger, but those estimates should be seriously argumented. Let's talk first about measuring growth. It's the left chart. We see that Russia is in red, and definitely Russia is sorry. Here's the growth. Sorry. And left chart is the growth, and you see that Russia is definitely better than. Sorry. Can you hear me? Because my desk is not managing.
I at least do see the slides.
I cannot manage them. Sorry. Okay.
Sergey, say what slide you want, the numbers of it.
Please, slide number 10. You see that in the slide number 10, I have the, yes, thank you. This is the red line is Russian growth since 2014, and definitely it's much slower than in countries of Central and Eastern Europe and Turkey, as Anders mentioned, but it's in line with Brazil, that is definitely lagging, it's in line with Chile, it's in line with Mexico and with South Africa. So there are countries that grow faster, and we can assume that the growth of Central European countries is more related with their membership in European zone, in European community, rather than to some factors that are related to Russian sanctions. Next point is decline in debt. The previous slide number 9, please. You may see that once again, yes, foreign debt by many emerging economies is growing fast, but if we decompose this growth in regions, we see that the red line is developing Europe, sorry, it's emerging Europe, it should be, and it's growing really slow and not different from Russia. On the right slide, it's more interesting. It's a Bank of International Settlements new issue, the amount outstanding of securitized debt. What Russian companies, not banks, but companies, were able to borrow in financial markets. And we see that since the second half of 2016, this amount started to grow tremendously. So yes, definitely there were sanctions that played their role until mid-2016. Nevertheless, afterwards, Russian companies came back to the market. Slide number 11, please. When we talk about the capital outflow, we should remember that it's definition from the balance of payment. And it includes, for example, increasing of reserves or decreasing of reserves by the central bank and Minister of Finance in Russia. And you see the red part of the chart is the role of those two agencies that may increase their reserves, and that is capital outflow, or decrease their reserves, and that is decline in capital outflow. And definitely just looking on the gross number of capital outflow from Russia, it's not correct. Moreover, we should remember that the balance of payment is a balance. And if you have current account that is a black line, positive, there should be definitely negative capital account. Otherwise, that doesn't work. Please, the next slide. Except of central bank and Minister of Finance, there is another very important component of the capital outflow, it's cash. If Russian citizens keep foreign cash, dollars or euros or Swiss francs in their pockets, in their wallets, that is capital outflow as well. And so if we deduct all those components, central bank, Minister of Finance and cash, we will see that, in fact, the capital outflow in Russia starting from 2015 to 2020 is not as big as we can imagine. And it is connected with the trade balance. If oil prices are higher, like it was in 2018, then means the capital outflow is a little bit bigger. Next slide. What is really was astonishing for me, I tried to decompose foreign direct investments according to Central Bank of Russia data, and we may say that foreign direct investments, if we look on the gross data, it's the first line, definitely declined from $55 billion per year in 2010-13 up to $20 billion in 2015-20. But Foreign direct investment is a very interesting component indicator as well. Within this data, we see reinvestment. For example, if McDonald's or Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola, they operate in Russia, if they reinvest their profits, that is foreign direct investment as well. And you see the second line, it's reinvestment. Reinvestment declined drastically. So that means that all foreign companies operating in Russia, they stopped to reinvest profits. And that is really very important. That is important for the business, for the economic growth. Nevertheless, if we see the total foreign direct investment minus reinvestments, we see that in fact they are negligible. They were $12 billion. Nevertheless, in the next 5 years, it was $22 billion. So we may say, yes, on the one hand, those who operate in Russia, they don't want to grow more. Nevertheless, new investors, they are coming to Russia, and that is very important. And the very last, maybe a statistical data. Next slide, please. I was surprised by the calculations made by the authors when they take the decline in potential foreign debt. They add the lack of capital outflow and foreign direct investment and relates all those to GDP. It's like take yellow plus round and measure all this in gallons. You see, that doesn't work in economic statistics, and definitely even if you assume that Russia lost some foreign direct investments, and if the number is correct, and if it is $168 billion, that doesn't mean that GDP of Russia will increase by this amount. Yeah, because this is investment, they are realized within a certain period of time, and they provide their effects for the years to go, and the effect of $168 billion of investment, maybe 1/10 of this amount per year, and it's going year by year. So that is I'm skeptical. So all the data provided by authors at least do not support their strong argument that Russia lost from Western sanctions much more than other authors anticipated. And the most important is that authors do say that there was decline in oil prices twice during this period of time, in 2014-15, and then in 2020. And that definitely played its role. And the second part is destruction of all institutional environment in Russia that really affects Russian economy. And because of that, Russian economy is losing a lot. And authors do not try to to attribute any effects to those two factors, saying, okay, all the decline in economic growth is because of sanctions. To my mind, it's a little bit skeptical. Next slide, please.
Well, Dr. Aleksashenko, could you wrap up? I want to give
just 2 points, two short points. Yeah. Recommendations. First of all, I believe that current sanctions do not can increase costs, but they work gradually and not very fast. What to do to follow the law? For example, Chemical and Biological Weapons Act, sanctions according to this act were not implemented as they were written in the law. Please, next slide on individual sanctions. I was surprised that only 67 Russians are in SDN list, out of which 12 are oligarchs. And if you look on the list of oligarchs, you see that 5 of them, they are CEOs of companies. And we see Rottenberg Jr., but we do not see Rottenberg Senior, Arkady or Boris. We see Volga Group, but not Timchenko. We see Power Machines, but not Mordashov. And we do not see anyone who was mentioned in Panama Papers who financed Putin's activity. And the very last slide. Maybe the key target of potential sanctions should be definitely the most sensitive part of the Russian economy, its oil sector. And I believe that the West cannot stop purchasing Russian oil, but the West can prohibit, for example, state-controlled oil companies to purchase some Western software or some Western equipment. Thank you so much, and excuse me for being a little bit long.
Thank you for that strong presentation, but let me turn to Dr. Snegovaya and Andres Åslund. to take on some of the points you made. And thank you for the stimulating presentation. Maria, I think the floor is yours, if you want.
I would allow Andres to answer first. I think it would be more correct given that he's an expert on this topic.
Very good. Anders, you're on.
Yeah, first of all, I don't see any point in making all these distinctions of the different financial flows. What matters is the total financial resources, and we have defined that very well in the paper. And the total financial resources have decreased, that Russia's total foreign debt has decreased by $259 billion. During these 7 years, while other emerging economies, the whole group on average have increased 30%, and then we have added foreign direct investment that has been foregone. I don't see that you in any way question that. To pick up one little group here and one little group there and say that this is important and the other is not important makes no sense. To me, this is just to drown in details and forget the overall. I did clarify how we have interpreted the IMF numbers, but this is just a matter of redefinition, that these are financial and fiscal effects. That's very much the report from the Institute of International Finance argued. The other papers are early and do not provide strong evidence. Essentially what we are saying is Russia's growth should, under normal circumstances, have been close to 5%. That's the laggard effect in relation to Central Europe. Why isn't it? Well, there are three factors: oil price, financial sanctions, and poor governance. The poor governance, as we argue in the paper, is to considerable extent connected with the sanctions. Putin has used them to increase the control by the cronies and by the state over the economy. So he has imposed the cost on the economy. And so poor governance is typical also of Brazil. It's not only commodity prices. Why we particularly lifted up the Central European countries is exactly as we argue in the report, that they have good governance because they are part of the European Union. You might say that Hungary and Poland are not stars, we write that, but they are far better than Russia. And if you take emerging Europe, you get Ukraine and Belarus in it. So this is quite an irrelevant measure because they suffer from the same problems as Russia. Also, if you go down in the Balkans, which is a reason that we did not use these. And finally, I should say that Timchenko is sanctioned. So you should check that list again. He was sanctioned in March 2014. And the effect of the sanctions, going back to that, when the financial sanctions were imposed the 16th of July and the 30th of July for the European Union in 2014. And the Russian offensive stopped, as you said, by the 5th of September agreement in Minsk. And what happened in February 2015, I would argue that was just, so to say, the Russians clarifying, taking over the Baltsova railway station and clearing out the border. That was not a major offensive. That was a clearing of the lines. So I do think that it stopped. And then, of course, you want much tougher sanctions, which you're perfectly welcome to say. We are suggesting a gradual tightening of them, and I'm very much in favor of going after the oligarchs that you want to sanction. So there we have no disagreement. Thank you.
Very good. I want to turn to the questions, and we have a pair of questions. And I want to put them both out. One is from Bob Otto. And Bob Otto, an expert in these issues for many years, says over the years, Putin has often complained about unjust and illegal sanctions. But a few Russian analysts have suggested that Putin doesn't actually fear new financial sanctions, that he will just use financial sanctions as a way to rally Russians and explain to them their impoverishment within the besieged Russian fortress. Bob's point is that Putin's logic may not coincide with ours, and that imposing costly sanctions may not be a deterrent. He may see them as useful for his own purposes. Now, another kind of a question, but somewhat to the same topic, is from Maria Shagina. She points out that the impact of economic sanctions goes beyond a purely economic dimension. What are the non-economic effects of sanctions on Russia, on the political elites that the authors of this paper have discovered? And how does this contribute or not contribute to the overall effect of sanctions? These are two almost twinned questions taking things from the opposite side. And I will ask actually both the authors, but any of the discussants. And I noticed that Elina Ribakova has her hand raised. And if you'd like to answer these questions, that would be great.
I will start briefly, but I do want to pass it on to Maria as well, because she has the expertise in this area. But very briefly on the fortress Russia and the besieged fortress, I think that worked exceptionally well post 2014 sanctions, and I think you can see that in some of the local polling data, where the anti-US and anti-EU sentiment has picked up significantly post 2014 sanctions. But if you look at that again now, that also has come down. So it's back to the sort of the normal averages in terms of the anti-Western sentiment, and of course also the approval ratings of the current administration are as well down. So I think that effect went for a while, but at this stage people are sort of fed up with it and maybe not paying as much attention to it. And just very quickly before I pass it on to Maria, in terms of the economics, if I may disagree briefly with both Sergey and Anders on this topic, and then we're going to spend another hour here. No, I'm joking, but I think the truth be told that what Maria is asking the question here is pertinent to this paper is the most important one, that economic sanctions effects go beyond the purely economic dimension. And I think this paper is trying to wrap everything in there. It's a brief paper, so it gives the highlights. On the economics part of it, I think Sergey is unparalleled in terms of his ability to analyze Russia's flows of funds. And I do think for the researchers out there, it's an important topic to dig through and go into detail, because the way the foreign FDI is recorded in Russia and many other countries is very fraught with difficulty. The same thing for other flows, unrecorded export proceeds. So there is a lot of work to be done following on this paper, maybe possibly disagreeing, but exactly unpicking these little details and making a research paper on its own, just from that comment that Professor Aleksashenko gave. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elina. Excellent comment, and thank you very much for our discussants for a very important contribution. I actually agree that I think this paper should be treated as a motivation for further discussion and more sophisticated measurements, because there is some status quo existing on the sanctions in the analysis, and it's actually, I think, very fruitful to exercise to try and challenge an existing status quo, given that the situation is in progress. On the questions that are very important, and I thank Bob Wata and Maria Shagina for important questions. First of all, the besieged fortress. There is a consistent concern about the Kremlin being able to manipulate and turn it in its own advantage, the sanctions that imposed on Russia. First of all, I think these concerns are a little bit over-exaggerated. First of all, if you look at how anti-Western sentiment fluctuates in Russia, looking at the polls, you notice that they always peak around the time when Russia starts a new war, be it Georgia, Ukraine, Syria. What does it tell you? That means that Russia's propaganda picks up around the same time, and the polls really just reflect what the television TV has to say to the Russian people. That actually has little to do with deeper seated sentiment of the Russians, and actually appears to be quite a shallow sentiment because it quite quickly changes subsequently as propaganda stops this coverage. In recent years, we actually observe much more demand for improved relationship with the West among the Russians, based on the polls. Therefore, the sanctions are not directly linked to the Kremlin's ability to brainwash the Russian population with anti-Western sentiment. These are two. It will always do that when it is in the Kremlin interest, because, as we have discussed before, the Kremlin's foreign policy is primarily based on defending the interests of its elites. More importantly, it will become increasingly harder to do, as Elina has pointed out, as the economic situation worsens. I have shown in my own research and the other studies that show that as Russia's economic situation declines, real disposable incomes have been in decline for the last, or stagnating for the last seven years. The actual support for assertive and aggressive militaristic actions and moves, it has been declining in Russia. Russians are quite rational in this sense, because we have a lot of domestic problems. Why waste resources on the outside? Therefore, the worse economic situation is, the fewer actual opportunities the Kremlin has to turn this sentiment, anti-Western sentiment, in its own favor. We see the trends are opposite. Second point, to address the question by Maria Shakina, there's two, at least I can point out two ways to answer this question. First of all, here in this report, we cite our my own research for SIPA done before, where there is some evidence of sanctions fostering the split among the elites or oligarchs with kind of money made primarily from the outside. This, like, for example, like, you can talk, I don't know, Vladimir Putin, somebody who sells makes money from something being sold outside from Russia, and the elites from domestic sources of money, primarily, I don't know, maybe that's something related to defense industry, etc., when the state essentially orders them the purchases from the oligarchs. That is the split. Again, it's a little bit hard to analyze since we lack the data, and the elites, Russians, are notoriously closed to the public. But unfortunately, despite this somewhat encouraging trends, we do not see that fundamentally being expressed in some kind of fundamental change in foreign policy, partly because the Kremlin very strongly, seriously compensates the elites who suffered from the Western sanctions, partly because of the fear of repressions and hardening Kremlin grip over the elites and the Russian population in the recent years. And of course, if you want to reinforce the effects of sanctions on the Kremlin elites, as Andres has pointed out, as Sergey Aleksashenko has pointed out, there needs to be a much stronger effort to be done to identify the assets the elites hold abroad, and to punish essentially the Kremlin cronies much stronger than it has been done until now. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Ariel Cohen, or rather a point from Ariel Cohen, which I would like to flip and turn it into a question for the panel. Ariel Cohen points out that there is considerable room to escalate sanctions in the Russian energy sector. He's written about this recently. Separately, Brian O'Toole and I wrote about this, the options for increased energy sector sanctions. Now, Dr. Åslund and Dr. Aleksashenko disagree about the impact of sectoral sanctions on the Russian economy, but they are in profound agreement about the need to go after Putin-aligned oligarchs, individual sanctions. What are the views of for anyone who wants to speak as to the efficacy on Putin's decision-making calculus of economic sanctions versus personal sanctions? And I should add that the United States government has done both from 2014, but in the early moves, the Biden administration did not target Putin's cronies. It went after individuals involved in individual specific bad actions and sectoral sanctions, namely a mid-sized step with respect to Russian debt. So of individual sanctions versus sectoral sanctions, Where do you all come out on this? Anders.
Thank you. Yeah, following up on what Maria Shagina suggested, I think that it's quite natural to try to divide the elite, and I think that is quite effective. So we can see that a large number of wealthy Russians are quietly selling off, leaving Russia, more or less, and they are not making any noises. And we can see that also from the big net capital outflows from Russia. So I think that it is an effective strategy. I agreed with you here that it was a disappointment that none of the oligarchs that have been mentioned all the time since 2018 were not sanctioned, and also with Sergey. We have now a list from Alexei Navalny of 35 names that he would like to see sanctioned, or from Vladimir Asherkulov, his man in Shurkov, his man in London. So I think that one should sanction people, and we can see from Putin's own statement that he really cares. He complained no less than 5 times in a year when his friends Boris and Arkady Rotenberg, Gennady Timchenko and Yuri Kovalchuk were sanctioned in March 2014. So this clearly matters for Putin a great deal. We also know that Timchenko refused to build a bridge over Kerch because he didn't want to be even more sanctioned. So then Arkady Rotenberg had to build the bridge to Crimea instead. So I think that the personal sanctions, as suggested in Katsa, as we saw then, were very effective, that people were really anxious not to be sanctioned. Thank you.
We have a question from Anna Ohanyan. The targeted and transparent sanctions are all well and good, but please comment on ways of communicating that message to the Russian people, that sanctions are focused on specific individuals, and I suppose to add the reasons for broader economic sanctions versus individual sanctions. What's the best way to get the message to Russian society? And again, this is for anyone on the panel who wants to take it.
Sounds for you, Maria.
Yes, I think it will be my question. Thank you. I do think it's a tricky point. The West does not have a lot of channels, unfortunately, information channels to communicate with the Russian population. Whatever remaining Western, linked outlets are currently being actually expelled from Russia as we speak, including Radio Free Europe. And from that perspective, I think we need to understand the constraints of our ability to fundamentally influence, have impact on the Russian population through the information channels. And that's unfortunately the reality with many autocracies. However, as I said before, the Kremlin's propaganda grip over Russians has been eroding over the last years. There is decline in number of people who watch Russia's TV channels. There is increasing number of people of those who take the information from the internet. And there's also overall broader dissatisfaction with the Kremlin. Therefore, it becomes actually a little bit harder to sell the general constant idea that Russia is a besieged fortress, hated by all of the countries. As you know, the Kremlin has recently proposed a list of countries that are unfavorable to Russia. And a lot of people, even in Russia, joke that pretty much excluding 2 countries like North Korea and maybe Venezuela, all the other countries get on this list. So from this perspective, I think it's important to understand the limitations. It's harder for us to sell, to explain, to fundamentally reach out to the Russian population. But there's some attempt done by Navalny's team where they point out specifically that it's the Russian oligarchs who are being targeted, not the population. However, to fundamentally change the Russian view on the Kremlin and support and affinity for Putin, it's important also to demonstrate that there's consequences for aggressive actions on the international stage, and that when ruling leaders fundamentally violate the laws, there's economic consequences that will be paid by the rest of the population. Thank you.
Thank you. I see sadly that we have gone through our allotted hour, and I'm sorry because there was much more to discuss, but I know better than to try to drag people who have days of an intense day of Zoom meeting. So I don't want to abuse people's time, but I want to thank the panel. Oh, by the way, for all listening, there is a link to Dr. Aleksashenko's slides. This has been a meaty and serious discussion. The paper covers both economic analysis, an assessment of Putin's regime, the impact of sanctions and recommendations for the future. Despite I note the disagreements about the economic impact, but I am impressed by the agreement on an important policy piece that I want to emphasize, which is the need to push ahead on individual sanctions. This discussion and discussions like it will continue into the future. Unfortunately, we have Vladimir Putin's Russia for now, and we'll have it tomorrow and for some time to come, and coming up with organized, sustainable ways to resist, even while we try to cooperate where we can and stabilize the relationship, is going to be a priority for the West. It is already an outline of the Biden administration's policy. I want to thank all of our panelists, the two authors and the two discussants, for a terrific and meaty discussion. I'm grateful to have gotten to moderate this. And to all of you who asked questions I didn't get to, I'm sorry. It's such as life in the era of Zoom meetings. So thank you very much, and I will bring this session to a close. Thank you all, and do read the paper. Do read Andres's and Maria's paper. It is worth it. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.